Hello guys and welcome back. Today I have a big kit on my desk, the Jagdtiger from Hobby Boss in 1:35 scale. It was a decision between Tarkom and Hobby Boss, and since everyone has built the one from Tarkom so far, I want to give this one a try. As expected, the journey starts with the running gear. All parts are carefully removed from their sprues and then cleaned up with a hobby knife and a sanding sponge if necessary. But on one of the first parts, we already encounter some ejector marks that need to be filled. For that I am using this thin and quick drying putty from Ammo by Mick. The parts then slot onto the front of the lower hull. The kit comes with a working torsion bar suspension, just like on my recent Leopard 1. Each bar is connected to a swing arm using Tamiya extra thin cement. Watch the instructions carefully, as there are two different types of swing arms for the front and back wheels. They are each inserted into the hull and connected at the opposite side. The fit is good, but there is one problem. You have no indication of what angle the swinging arms are supposed to sit at by default. The part that connects to the hull is hexagonal, but as soon as you add glue, it can move freely. So in order to have them at the correct angle, I had to check some other kits like my Qincas. I hope I got them right in the end. The axle for the return roller, on the other hand, is oriented using a guide pin in the hull. And then we get to the wheels. As expected, the Jagdtiger has quite a few. The first batch is made from two pieces glued together and then sanded to remove the small seam line. The remaining ones have this plate molded separately for more details. The return roller consists of a few parts to allow for an all-around level of detail. For the drive sprocket, the kit chose a rather unusual method of construction in my opinion. It is already connected to the transmission instead of being a removable part. So the drive sprocket will be permanently attached to the tank from now on, but that should not be much of a big deal. The road wheels are a bit more fiddly now. The kit wants you to attach them to the swing arms and then add the hubcaps in the middle. But I want to keep the whole wheel separate from the tank, so I need to attach each hubcap perfectly centered now to ensure I can still fit them onto the swing arms later. For the shorter ones, I decided to just stick them to the wheels, glue the hubcaps on in the correct place, and then swiftly take them off before the glue sticks to the swing arm. And now we arrive at the tracks. This kit includes workable tracks using separate guide horns. They are a bit more fiddly, but when built with precision, they work very nicely. The start is always the hardest. You have to add two of these links onto the slightly larger one. Then the two guide horns are attached to the larger link, sandwiching the smaller ones in between them. If you add the glue only onto the very middle part, making sure you do not touch the next link, they should remain workable. Of course, workable tracks always face the difficulty of finishing them. You either have to make it full circle, which makes the handling a bit more difficult, or you modify it a bit. In my case, I glued the last piece on just one side and then removed the pins from the other one. When the track is done, I can glue these parts with superglue and it should be a perfect fit. Okay, enough tracks for now. Let's get back to the more interesting stuff. Each exhaust is made of a few small parts. I find it kind of amusing how small the exhausts look compared to that giant tank. The pull hooks on their brackets are separate pieces like this. There are tiny nubs that need to be glued onto the armored exhaust covers. And then you need to remove the bolts from one side of each cover. This may be smarter to do before adding the details though. The bolts need to be removed in order to fit the tow bar. I want to keep the exhaust separate to allow for more detailed painting and weathering later. Since we have quite a few large positioning holes, that should be easy. But I want to make the exhaust covers and tow bar a single piece. So I dry fit everything and then just connect the two covers with the tow bar. Once the glue has set, I can remove them as one piece. A few more details on the rear plate are still missing. Here the Stockwinde would be stored, but I want to keep the bracket empty for a bit more variation. Then I can place the rear plate into the lower hull, making sure to align it properly so that you don't have any fitting issues with the superstructure later. It should slot right onto the two steps here. Now let's take a look at the most important thing on the Jagdtiger, the main gun. The 128mm gun is so large that it isn't even attached to the superstructure, but has to stand on a platform attached to the hull. This here is the breech. It consists of a few very nicely molded parts that fit together without any issues. You can show it in the open or closed position, even though it will hardly be visible later anyway. While building the whole gun and recoil mechanism, you just realize how gigantic that gun truly is. I do not want to imagine the noise inside when it fires. The gun is then fitted onto the elevation mechanism. You only glue it at the lower part to allow for vertical movement. And this here is the gunner's side that sticks out of the roof. Be careful, as this is quite a fragile part. I have knocked it off quite a few times during the entire build and had to glue it with superglue in the end. The fit of the machine gun port feels a bit weird. It looks like it's placed right, since the locator pin is in the correct place, but it still looks like it's sticking out too much. I will leave it like this shown in the instructions for now, but upgrade it later, as you will see. While the machine gun looks really good once finished, it was actually quite annoying to put together. Small contact areas for the glue, as well as minimal guidance from the instructions, didn't help. But it's pretty much invisible anyway, so who really cares? Next we have to attach the gun and the superstructure. For that I will be changing the orders from the instructions, as I think they make it more difficult than it has to be. First, I will be gluing the gun platform into the lower hull. There are 2 locator pins at the bottom to get the correct placement. Contrary to what the instructions say, I am now attaching the superstructure. This should be easier right now than later, since you have to slide it at an angle that would later be blocked by the gun. Once it is glued in place, I can place the recoil mechanism and breech onto the platform. At first glance, it looks like the gun keeps its horizontal traverse, but you need to glue it in place, as it would fall out otherwise. Then the frontal armor plate can be snapped into place. This part again was a little fiddly, as I need to make sure it is correctly aligned on both sides. Once it's placed correctly, you should hear a click and all gaps are closed. If the interior parts of the gun are not placed correctly, you might have trouble fitting this plate, as there is really not much space left. The actual gun barrel consists of 2 halves. Not ideal for such a long piece, so I will need to do some proper cleanup to make sure there won't be a visible seam left. You have 2 options for the gun mantlet. Sadly, the kit gives you 0 information about which mantlet was used under which conditions or on which vehicle. So I will choose the one that I think looks visually more interesting. Same goes for the roof, where you have the option to add a few more details by drilling out some holes. Again, no indication of which vehicles had those and which did not. After drilling the holes, make sure to clean up the other side with a hobby blade. The periscopes come as a clear part, even though I don't think I will bother with masking them. The end result never looks like I imagined, and it's just easier to paint them black later. There are a few details added to the inner side of the roof as well as the outside. While the periscope covers would look better as photo etch parts, they still look quite nice with the bolts added. For the engine cover, you get yet again two options for the placement of the anti-aircraft machine gun. For the placement I chose, I have to drill another hole. For small parts like these, it is quite helpful to have a third hand, especially when I want to record it like this. To keep the glue marks to a minimum, I am gluing parts from the inside whenever it is possible. Alright, now we are going to be a little bit destructive. The plastic weld beads look pretty shallow, so I will be removing them and then trying my own. To remove them, I am using some cheap micro chisels I bought online. Those are fine and sharp enough to precisely remove the previous ones. First, I slowly drag them over the plastic, creating a slight groove as a guide. Then I can apply a bit more pressure and start to remove some plastic. At the end, there should be a rather deep cut all along the previous weld bead. Especially at the rear plate, that upgrade is necessary, and to clean them up I use Tamiya's extra thin cement. But before we make the new weld beads, I want to add the steel texture. I use Tamiya putty this time compared to my usual putty from AK. This one needs to be thinned with either Tamiya extra thin cement or airbrush cleaner, and that stuff is chemically the same anyway. In this case here, the putty from Tamiya is better for me, as it can be reactivated with glue. That means I can still glue on the details later with normal cement. I am applying the putty over all larger surfaces in a stippling motion. This creates many small bumps and irregularities over the surface that resemble the rather steel texture. When the putty has fully cured, I sand the surface with a very fine sanding sponge. That removes all the sharp edges and makes it more uniform again. These are all the little hooks for the spare tracks. On one side I added them after the texture, but in the end both ways had about the same amount of effort. I want my Jagdtiger to look quite beat up. That's why I will be completely removing one of the front fenders. The kit offers you these locators to attach them, but since they won't be a fender, I can cut it and sand it down. The flame cut marks are yet another detail that looks kind of low quality on the plastic kit. Luckily, that is probably one of the easiest upgrades you can do to your tanks. All you have to do is cut the wanted parts with a sharp hobby blade, leaving many small cuts. Once you're satisfied, you can take some extra thin cement and melt it down a little, softening the edges. The top edge here is missing any texture at all. This part should have been flame cut as well. Instead of my knife, I will be using a rough diamond file. This leaves an irregular, rough texture that should look pretty good once weathered. And then it is time to redo the weld lines. For that I am using Tamiya's 2-part epoxy QuickTime putty. 2 equal parts are mixed together until they are uniform in color and then rolled into thin noodles. I recommend using a bit of water to keep it from sticking to everything. Then the noodles are pressed into the previously made gaps with a moistened toothpick. The putty has a limited working time, but it is enough to fill all the gaps in one go. That way it also has enough time to begin sticking to the plastic. Now it is time to add the texture. I made myself a tool similar to the one Night Shift uses. A rolled up piece of can glued to a toothpick. With that I am now making the single line weld beads. I may need to reshape my tool a bit in the future, but the result looks quite decent already. Having such large welds is definitely a good thing, as it makes the whole process a lot more beginner friendly. Here I am also upgrading the machine gun port I talked about earlier. I removed the weld around it with a chisel, and then I can wrap a bit more putty around it. This is then pressed into shape with a toothpick, and once it's set, textured with the previously used tool. After doing the welds, it is time for a few more plastic details, like this hook on the mantlet. I missed a few parts I wanted to add more texture to. But since I don't want to gas myself with Tamiya putty and airbrush cleaner again, I switched to the water-based putty. Why is the putty white and not grey? No idea, that was the first tube I grabbed. The putty is then smoothed again with a sanding sponge. Now is also a good time to add the one lonely fender this Jagdtiger will get. Under normal circumstances, the Jagdtiger would have a travel lock attached to the front plate here. But I want to leave that off and only attach the empty hinges. That should add a bit more character and make it look more battle-used than a factory fresh one. The kit includes quite a few photo-etched parts, which I have ignored so far. I made myself this very professional glue applicator from a broken paintbrush, a bent wire and washi tape. Most parts are added to the engine deck here, as to be expected. I would say the photo-etched engine grills are by far the most visually important parts on a kit, so it's always nice to see them already included in the box. But there are also some more unusual photo etch parts included, like this piece on the headlight. Since they are all quite small, it is not really that easy to record me putting them together, so I will just show you the finished parts later. kept most handles as the plastic part from the kit, as they were either looking thin enough or had small welds added to the bottom. But the handles for the rear doors look just awful, so I replaced them with a piece of metal wire bent using my bending tool. The hinges on the doors are not supposed to be glued. Instead, they snap onto the door and the bracket at the rear. But you do need quite a bit of force here to snap them on. Some of the grooves had to be sanded larger to make it easier. Once you're done, you have a working door that shall forever stay closed on this model. Here I made a bit of a mistake, so watch closely to avoid doing the same. The side skirts would be attached to these locator holes. Since I do not want to add the side skirts, these areas will stay visible. In reality, the Jagdtiger had tiny protruding brackets here. To replicate them, I cut thin rectangles from polystyrene and glued them over the holes. All good so far, right? Nope, as I later realized, set brackets are actually included but never mentioned in the instructions. And they look a lot better than my makeshift plastic ones. So I had to scrap off the DIY ones and reattach the ones that are supposed to be here. A lot of extra work for something that I could have seen earlier. Now let's get back to adding some nicer details. A lot of the tools have photo etched parts to upgrade them. I really like the bracket on these wire cutters here. The Jagdtiger carries a lot of stuff on its sides, like tow cables and most of its tools. I was thinking about whether or not I want to add them or keep them separate. In the end, I decided to just attach them all. I just did not feel like having a dozen separate parts. That would be a nightmare to handle. This does make streaking effects or oil dot filters a bit more annoying later, but at this point I have not even decided if I want to do those weathering steps at all. A nice detail to upgrade your photo-etched engine grills is to slightly press them down using the end of a paintbrush. That would happen naturally whenever the crew walks there, and it adds a nice amount of depth to the kit. The Jagdtiger has quite a few flame cut marks, so I forgot them in a few places. Best to do it now before it's too late. Now all that is left is to assemble the air defense machine gun and stick it onto the rear plate. And we are done with the construction. Let's take a look at what we have achieved this episode. This is a massive tank. I have added a tank commander in the hatch just to give you an idea of the size of this thing. So far I am quite happy with choosing the one from Hobby Boss. I didn't have any major problems during the build, and it was an overall very pleasant construction. This is the first time I did weld beads, which I am actually kind of satisfied with, so that's another plus. This should be a nice base for painting it next episode, so I cannot wait for that. I'm not sure what figure I want to add here. I do have a few options, but they kind of depend on whether I want a diorama in action or a more relaxed one. So what do you prefer? If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to never miss any uploads. Any feedback or suggestions, let me know in the comments. Thank you all for watching and see you next time.